Hi, and welcome to Debunk File. My name is Sep, and today we are going to talk about Jack the Ripper, the most famous serial killer in history. It's a name that sadly doesn't need an introduction. Just saying that name conjures up images of a silent stalker in a top hat and cape, supposedly murdering prostitutes for entertainment. This man turned the autumn of 1888 from a faded memory to an immortal time of terror. This isn't a true crime buff, London historian, or law enforcement officer alive who hasn't heard about the demon of Whitechapel. For those who study serial killers, there is a clear pre-Ripper era and post-Ripper era. Little was the same when the year ended. Talking about the Ripper's legacy is difficult because it's so vast. He's so talked about that there's actually a term for people that study him called Ripperology. Usually the thing we do here is mention the countless pieces of media he's in, but really that isn't even necessary this time around. Instead, we have a different question to ask, and that is, can you name a single victim of his in this case? Do you know the people that were unfortunately taken from the spree? Do you simply refer to them as common prostitutes and move on? When you hear the term Jack the Ripper, do you think of a genius, superhuman fiend? For this haunted night, we will answer all of these questions and more. On this night, we will talk at great length about London's most legendary boogeyman. We will unmask the Ripper, if not in identity, then at least in image. Is someone like him really deserving of this much attention? We will go over some of the suspects and theories. Like his famous literary enemy Sherlock Holmes, perhaps deductive reasoning will prevail in finding a plausible subject. But most importantly of all, we will talk about the 5 women he killed. Not as just puzzle pieces in a cruel game of Clue, but as human beings. People that deserved better than to be remembered as just gory photographs. Before we begin this odyssey, there are many people we would like to thank, but one name stands out most. Historian Haley Rubenhold, whose book, The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper, was essential to the making of this video. Without it, we wouldn't even have such a unique perspective on Victorian London, and our understanding of the sad stories surrounding the victims would be forever untold. Lastly, this is a content warning for the rest of the video. We won't be showing graphic photos, and descriptions of violence will be kept at a minimum, but the stories of the 5 are profoundly sad. They contain alcoholism, sexism, classism, police brutality, domestic abuse, and many other very heavy themes. If you can't stomach this, we understand, and advise skipping this video. For everyone else, come with us, back to the autumn of terror. The London of 1888 was truly a tale of two cities. On one hand, you had the lives of the upper class, some of the wealthiest people in Europe. Queen Victoria had recently celebrated her Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne. In her honor, a grand banquet had been thrown, with numerous other royal families invited. This was the London the British Empire wanted the world to see. For many, it wasn't the real London. The other half lived in such terrible squalor that the mind has difficulty believing people could be so cruel to their fellow man. The lower class had been crushed by the economic Long Depression, an event that had begun decades ago and yet still continued. Waves of immigrants from places like Ireland and Russia came to England hoping for a better life, but most were sorely disappointed. These people were greeted by nativism, racism, anti-Semitism, and violence. Social upheaval was in the air, led by reformers and social revolutionaries, often punctuated by protests, riots, and police brutality. At the heart of all this was a system created decades prior to criminalize and discourage poverty as if it was a choice. In this world stepped 5 women, destined to be remembered, albeit for the wrong reasons. The first was Mary Ann Nichols, better known as Polly. She was born Mary Ann Walker on August 26, 1845, the second of 3 children. Her father, Edward, was a blacksmith. Her mother, Caroline, was a homemaker. Polly was a common nickname for Mary. She grew up near Fleet Street, of Charles Dickens and Sweeney Todd fame, which was more or less the heart of newspapers and publishing in London. Life as a little girl in London was not easy. Housing was painfully small, entire families were stuffed into poorly ventilated rooms that measured 8 to 10 feet at best. They only had one room and often shared one bed. Privacy was impossible. Buildings were constantly in disrepair, and access to clean water was a constant challenge. Despite this, Polly's parents had enough money to get her an education, as she was in a British school until she was 15. Uncommon for a girl of the era, she learned to read and write, perhaps a benefit of living so close to the street of ink. Her childhood involved seeing death far too often. She watched her mother and younger brother both die by the great killer of the era, tuberculosis, a disease with no cure. This all forced her to grow up way too fast, until this saga of her life eventually ended when marrying a 21-year-old son of a painter named William Nichols. Life with William Nichols was full of many ups and downs. She lost her attempted first child, but then had 3 children, Edward, George, and Alice. They heard of George Peabody, an associate of Junius Spencer Morgan, who wished to help the poor people of London by making better quality homes and more spacious houses. But not just anyone could live in these buildings. Things like being native-born and possessing strong moral character were requirements. Something as minor as having a drinking problem or any police record was enough to be denied. But as luck had it, Polly and her family were approved. One can only imagine how happy Polly was to live in a sizable apartment-like complex with running water and several large rooms. As the years went on, though, the relationship fell apart. They constantly argued, and these arguments got more and more toxic, with a common occurrence of Polly leaving but returning again and again becoming common. On March 29th, 1880, though, she'd leave for good. After eventually finding her footing, this meant that she'd have to enter the absolutely dreadful workhouse, which was closer to a prison than a workplace. People were called inmates, families were separated, food was given out at specific times of day in terrible condition, and pay was unlivable. The goal of these workhouses was to criminalize poverty, more or less. To scare people into never becoming poor. Sure, you could just avoid entering a workhouse, but that left you with few options outside of thievery, begging, and prostitution. Polly also wasn't technically divorced, which meant she'd be seen as an adulteress if she'd ever struck up a relationship with another man. She couldn't depart from William unless she could prove he was sexually abusing her, which was impossible. Regardless of what she did, she would be seen as a failed wife, a failed mother, and a failed woman. The Victorian age was so easily quick to judge and rarely forgiving. The only option Polly had was to secure an official separation via the assistance of a workhouse, forcing William to pay for the stay in so-called outdoor relief, a type of weekly pay that meant she didn't need to stay for long. With a heavy breath, she endured immense humiliation and personal questions before entering the prison-like structure known as the Lambeth Union Workhouse. Her plan surprisingly worked. The guards believed her, and soon enough, William was making payments to his wife, and she didn't need to stay in a workhouse. This too wouldn't last either. While Polly was working terrible jobs, William sent out a private investigator in hopes of finding something incriminating so that he didn't have to pay her anymore. The investigator found her living with a man named George Crenshaw, which was enough proof to accuse her of adultery, and the payments soon stopped, forcing her back into the workhouse. After leaving the workhouse this time, she returned to her father's home and brought a terrible friend: alcohol. Her father and brother tried to help her, but she'd leave in 1884 in terrible shape. By this point in her life, she bounced around various jobs, workhouses, and the streets, all while her alcoholism got worse. By December of 1886, she truly had no one to go to and was on the streets, now being a direct target of vagrancy laws. The difference between a female tramp and a prostitute was narrow in the law's eyes, something that is very important to remember. Even after this, the cycle of going to the workhouse, finding a home to work in, and then begging in the streets still repeated. One of these homes she worked in belonged to Sarah and Samuel Cowdrey, morally righteous rich folks who needed a new maid. She finally had a clean bed again, but these people were hardly her friends. She was taken to church every Sunday and forced to remember her place in society, told she led a sinful life and had to repent, which only made her feel worse about herself. She eventually left the Cowdreys, moving to the dreaded Whitechapel district, and spent time in a lodge called Wilmot's alongside a kind woman named Ellen Holland. Polly soon ran low on money again and moved to another lodge. That same cycle continued until August 31st, 1888, her final night. She had been staying at a lodge called the White House until around midnight, where she was spending the rest of her money at a pub called the Frying Pan, drinking away until 12:30 a.m. She walked back to the Wilmots soon after, quite intoxicated, when the lodgekeeper refused her because she lacked any money. Polly promised she would get some more. The press would quickly write about this claim as proof she was a prostitute, but those who knew her best claim otherwise. It was the only dignity she had left, and it wasn't something she was willing to give up. She was more likely trying to sell something like her bonnet. At 2:30 a.m., Ellen Holland saw her old friend stumbling down Whitechapel Road. She tried to convince her to come back to the lodge with her, but Polly kept saying she couldn't. She cried about spending all her money, clearly sorry she did so. Despite Ellen's pleas, Polly told her nothing could be done, so she continued to walk down the road towards Buck's Row. It was the last time anyone saw Mary Ann Nichols alive.
Flicker of the window lights and distant lamps guided me. Left foot, right foot. Sometimes I'd hang onto the wall for balance. When I wasn't looking at the ground, I gazed up and wondered, it's straight. I'd never been here before my whole life. Must be miles away from Fleet Street. The sudden thoughts of that place reminded me of Mum and Dad. Soon all the memories came floating back. Happy days, tearful partings, the regrets. My left foot gave out at me near the gate of the stable. I couldn't go any further. That demon drink had taken its toll. I sat with my back to the gate and cried. It was all just too much. Why had I forsaken my own children? Every insult was true. I was a terrible mum. I may as well have been a harlot. I prayed to our Lord, hoping I could take it all back, but I couldn't. Dad always said he'd take me back, but I didn't want him to see his only remaining child like this. A wretched sight. A child nobody could love. I sat there, waiting for Bobby to come by, move me along, but he never came. The silence was deafening. How much time had passed? Minutes? Hours? In that silence, my mind couldn't stop thinking of my dad. Paying for my education when he could barely afford it. All the second chances he could give me when he didn't need to. Perhaps he did still love me after all this time. He had nobody else left, same as me. I tried to wipe the tears from my cheek and take a deep breath. I soon made a promise. Tomorrow, I would go and see him. It won't fix much, but it will make both of us feel perhaps a little better. I tried to move my legs. I was just too exhausted. The spot was comfortable enough for the night. I moved slightly away from the stable door and laid flat in front of it. Closed my eyes and dreamed of seeing my family once again. How happy he would be to see his little girl again. I only felt a hand over my mouth for a moment. I never felt the knife.
At 3:40 in the morning, a carman going by the name Charles Cross thought he saw a tarpaulin lying in front of a stable gate. Upon closer inspection, he found out it was a woman. Her face was still warm to the touch, but her hands were cold. Cross and another man, Robert Paul, quickly looked for a constable, eventually finding one and telling him about the woman, whom they thought was either asleep or dead. The two men promptly got back to work and left the area. Within a few minutes, several constables were inspecting the woman. With the use of lanterns, they could see a large gash in her neck and blood pooling around her. She was sadly dead. Nobody knew it was Polly Nichols at the time. She was just another murder victim in Whitechapel. Dr. Reese Ralph Llewellyn, a local medical officer, was brought to the scene and did a brief analysis. Polly was soon taken to a nearby mortuary to avoid prying eyes. Dr. Llewellyn did a complete examination of the poor woman. Her throat had been cut twice from left to right with a sharp, strong blade, presumably a bootmaker's knife or a cork cutter. The windpipe and gullet had been cut through, and the spinal cord had been struck. Death was instantaneous. She likely didn't feel a thing. There was minor bruising on the face and cheek, implying whoever did this had put his hand over her mouth. The most horrifying revelation was the damage to the stomach. Several deep knife wounds ran down the abdomen, violent enough to expose the intestines, alongside some downward stabs into her privates. No organs were missing, and Llewellyn stated the killer had some rough anatomical knowledge. Dr. Llewellyn felt the wounds took roughly 5 minutes to create. Llewellyn also said it was one of the ghastliest sights he'd ever seen. The reaction to the murder of Polly was moderate at best. She hadn't been the first woman killed in Whitechapel that year. Emma Smith had been beaten to death by a gang in April, and Martha Tabram had been stabbed to death on August 7th. Still, it was enough for Scotland Yard, the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police, to dispatch a seasoned detective to the area. Frederick George Aberline was an inspector and knew Whitechapel better than most. The first order of business was identifying the victim. This was done in less than 24 hours. Ellen Holland was brought in the same day of the murder and quickly identified her dear friend Polly. Her father Edward and even estranged husband William also confirmed it. Despite not seeing his wife in years, William was a mess, quietly telling the woman he had fought with so much, "I forgive you, as you are, for what you have been to me." Even with Inspector Aberline, the police had almost nothing to go on. It was clear the victim didn't know the killer. Nobody had heard or witnessed anything that night. All they had was how she was murdered and a rough timeline. No constable had seen anything in Bucks Row at 3:15 a.m., and judging by how warm her body was, she hadn't been dead for more than 10 minutes. Charles Cross may have just missed the killer. Some people, including police, wondered if there was a connection to the Tabor murder, but it was a tenuous connection at best. The mood in Whitechapel was of discontent. Not yet panic, but many were worried that whoever did this would strike again. The woman known to the world as Mary Ann Nichols, but Polly to those who cared about her, was buried on September 6th. In life, she was a quiet but sad mother and wife, never given a chance by society. In death, she would become a darling of the newspapers printed where she had been born. Her final moments drawn over and over again. The funeral was entirely paid for by Ellen, Edward, and William. Thousands of locals came out to mourn her death. Few knew her, but those who did spoke of a kind but troubled woman. The people closest to her were hit the hardest. One can only imagine Ellen Walker's pain, having never fully reconciled with the daughter he always cared for. Sadly, this sorrow would be repeated 4 more times in the weeks to come. Annie Eliza Smith was born sometime in September of 1841. Her father, George, was a soldier in the 2nd Queen's Life Guard, a prestigious cavalry regiment tasked with guarding the ruler of the monarch. He was present at the funeral of King William IV and the coronation of Victoria. In 1840, he fell in love with a servant girl named Ruth Chapman, and they soon had a child, little Annie. The military defined Annie's family. She grew up in the barracks her father served in. The sanitary conditions were marginally better than Polly's childhood home. Throughout her life, she was able to experience a really strange mix of both the upper and lower class, as moving from barracks to barracks was common. She also had 5 other siblings: George, Emily, Eli, Miriam, and William. She would have been used to seeing Victoria in person, and the lessons drilled into her by school would have been of dignity, grace, and honor. Yet her parents didn't privately own a home and had to share space with other families, including kitchens and bathrooms. Despite living in much better conditions as a child than Polly, disease still struck all the same, even if it wasn't thought to strike anyone other than the working class. She witnessed 4 siblings die from disease in very close proximity to each other, which shook her and her family up. They'd never truly be the same despite having more children afterwards. By age 15, Annie was on her own working as a servant. In the late 1850s, she was a housemaid for William Lure, an architect living in Westminster. Working as a maid for the rich was quite a difficult job. There was never a time to stop and catch her breath. She was always cooking, cleaning, and other odd jobs. She rarely would see her family. Servants at best earned 1 day off per month. Her father, on the other hand, was now 40, which was too old to be a soldier, but he could become a valet for an officer and eventually a butler. This was an amazing job with great pay, but he was perhaps given too much free time. As a shock to absolute everyone, he'd kill himself. Thinking about the family he wished he could see, it was just too much. It's unknown how her mother or other siblings reacted to the loss, but something else that came with that was his military pension expiring, meaning money was now a huge problem. Ruth began renting out her room to lodgers, one of whom being a young man named John Chapman, who Annie would meet on a rare day off, and eventually fall for and marry him in 1869. With him, Annie still lived in that strange nether between the working and middle class. He had his own house and knew influential people, but it was still a tiny home. How Annie saw herself is complicated. Unlike the other victims, there are several photographs of her, even dressed in fine clothing. But she was especially close with her mother, who lived paycheck to paycheck. She understood what it felt like to be poor, and what it felt like to be doing okay. By June 1870, the couple had a daughter, Emily. There was little she wouldn't do for her child. In 1879, John was hired by an incredibly upper-class man named Francis Barry, and they officially became middle class. Annie could afford her own maid, she had a fireplace and a heated house, and she loved boasting about it. But a familiar problem seeped into view and ended what sounds like a dream finally come true. Annie Chapman also had an alcohol problem. She'd been drinking as early as the deaths of her 4 siblings, and it got significantly worse after marrying John. Surprisingly, it wasn't because of abuse or anything, it was actually because he wasn't around much. He was always out working, and this gave her lots of time to think. This alcohol likely served to both pass the time and drown out her memories of loss. This problem even went on to affect future children in multiple ways. One suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome, one was prone to seizures later in life, which was likely a direct result of drinking while pregnant, and many others died either stillborn or just days after birth. Annie's sister knew she was struggling with her demons and tried their best to help Annie. She wanted to give up drinking, but she just couldn't find the strength to stop. As if it couldn't get worse, Annie's favorite child, Emily, came down with meningitis. Remembering the fate of her past siblings, she confided in not her family, but the bottle. She wasn't even present on the bedside of Emily when she passed away on November 26th. She was probably drinking her sorrows away. She became known around where she lived as a drunk, and her family eventually checked her into a sanatorium to deal with her illness, which was possible due to the Habitual Drunkards Act, which allowed rehabilitation for alcoholics rather than prison. The idea was to keep people active until the addiction began to wear down, where they then would be released back into society. After a year being here, she was let out and appeared she had won the battle, but this wouldn't last. Upon returning to the bottle almost instantaneously after finding her way out, she was truly more upset at herself than anyone could be at her. She was in an intense stage of self-loathing, and this time it directly affected her relationship. Her husband's employer then made him choose to either stay with Annie in what would likely be a life of poverty, or leave her, and he chose the latter. Really, he was heartbroken over this decision, and Annie understood perfectly. John wanted to ensure her safety, and so he promised to pay her weekly. Annie stayed with her mother for a short while, where her self-hatred only became worse, and eventually met a man named Jack Seavey. They moved to Whitechapel, a place so different from Windsor. These homes were much more similar to the ones Polly lived in, so in a word, they were horrible. In December of 1886, John's money stopped without warning, and Annie eventually found out he was dying. Annie literally ran back to Windsor in a few days and found him on his deathbed. He'd actually retired 6 months prior, and he too began drinking after letting her go. He died on Christmas Day. The cause was cirrhosis of the liver, likely by hepatitis and not drinking. If Annie wasn't low before, she was broken now. She reportedly sobbed uncontrollably and cared little about the future. Due to his death, she didn't receive money anymore and went days without eating. By 1887, she was suffering from tuberculosis. Another fatal disease had come to claim the life of a Chapman. It made something as simple as getting out of bed extraordinarily difficult, and she required frequent medical attention. She tried to make ends meet selling crochets and flowers, and occasionally wrote to her sisters asking for money, too ashamed to see them in person. Again, something important to note was that she was never a prostitute. She was too sick to even fathom the idea. She knew her last days were approaching. She was pale and can barely function. At this stage, a man named Edward Stanley helped pay for a room at a lodge called Crossinghams, but this was only for a few days a week. These other days meant she had to sleep on the streets alone. She no doubt heard about Polly's murder, but it didn't stop her from sleeping under the stars. Perhaps this was a sign of fatalism. Why worry about murder when the specter of death already hanged over her? On Friday the 7th of September, Annie would be seen for the last time. She had left near Crossinghams to get money, which she'd spend on drinking. She came home at 1:45 a.m. when Deputy Keeper Timothy Donovan asked to see what money she had to pay for her bed. She had none. She begged him to let her sleep for the night, but he refused, and she walked out into the night for the final time. Our best guess is that she went to 29 Hanbury Street near Spittle Fields, as this address featured a 3-story building with a large backyard, and a door that was never locked. It was a common sleeping spot for the homeless and prostitutes, and Annie likely had been to it on several occasions. She laid down next to a fence with her head close to the steps. We can only pray that her last few hours of sleep on Earth were pleasant.
I woke from my slumber. I didn't know what time it was. It was another dream of what used to be. I used to be someone. I know pride is a sin, but it was something I couldn't get out of my head. Oh, how I wish I had a drink to forget it. I can still feel the fabric of the dresses, the loving embrace of a husband, the adoration of a child. I'll never feel such things again. It won't be long now. I can feel the life slowly fade with each breath. Where do we truly go when it's all over? How will I be judged? I failed, but I tried. Damn it, I tried. I put my head back down and tried to sleep again. The pain wouldn't stop. I can feel myself falling, and nobody to help. I suddenly felt something grip my throat. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I couldn't see his face. I saw the knife coming closer. My last thoughts were of John. Don't leave me.
At around 6 a.m., a local living at 29 Hanbury Street named John Davis walked out into the yard and noticed a woman lying dead near the door. Davis ran and told several people that someone had been murdered. Police Surgeon Dr. George Baxter Phillips arrived at 6:30 a.m. He could clearly see several violent wounds to her neck and stomach. It was bad enough that he didn't even want to describe them in great detail during a later inquiry. An hour later, Dr. Phillips looked over the sad remains and noticed a lot of swelling around the face, signs of partial strangulation. There were 2 large knife wounds to the throat similar to Polly. However, injuries to the stomach were far worse. It was entirely opened up. Organs were placed on her shoulders. Some organs like the bladder and uterus were missing altogether. He believed it would take upwards of half an hour to do all this. Phillips thought this was the work of a medical doctor, an opinion he never wavered on despite contention from his colleagues. He believed the knife used was similar to those used by slaughtermen. Dr. Phillips gave the time of death to be around 4:30 a.m. due to the body's temperature. Unlike Polly, Annie was cold to the touch. She had been dead for some time. It didn't take long for Annie to be identified. Later that day, her friend Amelia Palmer was allowed into the mortuary. She recognized her friend immediately. Her family likely learned not long after. They sat silently grieving, as they had for all the other losses. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson was placed in charge of the Chapman murder, and during the investigation, a number of discrepancies came up involving the time of death. At 4:45 a.m., a tenant named John Richardson briefly opened the door to the yard. He didn't see a body. At 5:20, a local named Albert Kadosh heard someone say the word no, followed by something falling against a fence. Most notably, at 5:30, a woman named Elizabeth Long saw a man talking with a lady she was sure was Annie. She didn't see him very well, but claimed he was about 40, wearing a deerstalker hat and coat, and looked foreign, a code word for Jewish. London police eventually sided with the witnesses over Dr. Phillips, but that might have been the wrong move. Kadosh and Long were interviewed days after the murder, and the human mind can be faulty, especially when it comes to a minor detail. Richardson is more complicated. He changed his story from looking out the door to cutting leather off his shoes when questioned. He repeatedly said there was no way he could have missed Annie's body, but he wasn't looking for human remains, and the sun was only just starting to come up. The most logical outcome is that Richardson missed Annie's body by inches, and that the two witnesses misheard a noise and misidentified two people. Elizabeth Long's description was briefly the most popular sketch of the killer, despite probably not being him. It was the only example that night. Close to Annie's body was a bloodied leather apron belonging to Richardson. It had been there for a couple of days, but because it was so close to a crime scene, he was investigated as a suspect before being cleared. Now, why does this matter? Well, shortly after Polly's death, rumors began spreading about a violent Jewish figure called Leather Apron. He might have been real or a figment of the imagination, but now there was evidence of a leather apron. People began searching for this figure. What had been mild interest to local papers was now front-page news. Hundreds of people protested in the streets demanding justice be done. A killer was lurking the streets of Whitechapel, and multiple victims were now linked. A group called the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee was soon founded days after Annie's death. Its goal was to patrol the streets for suspicious characters and assist the police. George Lusk was elected its leader. While it wasn't a lynch mob, groups that very much fit that description were active. The City of London found its leather apron in the form of John Pizer, a local Jewish bootmaker. Pizer was sometimes called Leather Apron, and he had a history of assaulting women, even stabbing one with a knife. On September 10th, Pizer was arrested. He had been hiding in his home out of fear a mob would come and kill him. He was quickly cleared of suspicion, but the belief that the killer was called Leather Apron and that he was Jewish persisted. It's sadly not shocking that many people in London believed a native-born citizen wasn't capable of being behind these attacks. It had to be someone else, and with a large influx of Jewish citizens from Eastern Europe entering London, an easy scapegoat was created. Local Jewish businesses were threatened, and anyone who looked different was considered a suspect. London police did their best to prevent mass violence. Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, who was already unpopular due to the events of Bloody Sunday the previous year, went out of his way to say the Jews are not behind these series of murders. Annie Chapman was buried on September 14th. It was a quiet, dignified affair, more reflective of the woman she had been in her youth than the sad figure she was in death. Dr. Phillips said that the tuberculosis would have killed her in a few months, no matter how hard Annie tried to survive, and she tried. Death was always waiting for her. It merely came sooner than she or anyone who knew her would have liked. Her killer simply took the last vestiges of life, not already lost due to drinking and disease. Day after day, the panic continued through the East End of London. Comparisons were made to past individuals we would now call serial killers, like the infamous Burke and Hare. In Scotland Yard, people like Swanson and Aberlin continued to try and find evidence and a motive. The most commonly discussed one was the lunatic theory, that the killer was a homicidal maniac with an intense hatred of women. Criminal psychology of the era was primitive, to put it lightly, and evidence gathering was even more simplistic than those used by the New Orleans Police Department when looking for the Axeman. The first known murder case solved by fingerprints happened in 1892, 4 years in the future. DNA evidence as an idea would have been considered science fiction. Hans Gross's influential Handbook for Magistrates, Police Officials, and Military Policemen didn't hit the shelves until 1893. The entire field of criminalistics more or less just didn't exist. The best tools London constables had were interviews, investigations, and detainment. Not a lot when considering the area was large, difficult to document, and not favorable to police interference. During this time frame, when the Autumn of Terror truly began in earnest, and men patrolled the street day and night, letters started being sent to local papers and the police themselves. They were obviously fake, claiming information that was wrong or absurd motivations. Most were ignored on the spot, but one wasn't. On September 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter initially considered a hoax, before being forwarded to Scotland Yard out of curiosity 2 days later. Before that point, most newspapers referred to the killer as Leather Apron, which soon changed forever. The letter reads as follows.
Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't
fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track.
The joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I am down on wars, and I shan't quit ripping them until I do get buckled.
Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal.
How can they catch me now? Love my work and want to start again.
You'll soon hear of me with my funny little games.
I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with.
But it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope.
Next job I do, I shall clip the ladies' ears off, send them to the police officers, just for jolly. Wouldn't you?
Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance.
Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands, curse it.
No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now.
It was the first ever mention of the name Jack the Ripper. Scotland Yard didn't think much of it, but the events of the following day would make them think twice. The events of September 30th would forever be known as the Double Event. It kicked the newspapers and police into a complete frenzy. At the heart of it were two more innocent women. The first was a Swedish-born woman, Elizabeth Stride. Born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter on November 27, 1843, she wasn't quite what her parents wanted. Gustav and Beata Eriksson wanted a son to help run the family farm, but they accepted her all the same. The farm was close to a small collection of houses called Stora Tumlahed. Rural life in Sweden at the time was reasonably equal when it came to gender. Everyone sat at the same table and ate the same meals. Life still wasn't easy though, as working the fields under the beautiful northern European night sky was commonplace. Sunday was by far the most important day of the week for the Lutheran Eriksson family, which was reflected in Elizabeth. Unlike Polly and Annie, she was taught very little outside of reading and mathematics. Understanding the Bible was considered the most essential task. At age 15, Elizabeth was confirmed at Torslanda Church not far from her farm. A year later, she left the farm and moved to Gothenburg to find work as a servant girl. Like a bird leaving the nest, it was considered traditional for a child to go out on her own. She soon found employment under Lars Fredrik Olsen, a middle-class manager of sorts. She spent her time doing whatever job she was told to do there, until suddenly quitting for unknown reasons in 1864. We do know she continued work as a servant girl for some unknown individual, a relationship that eventually turned lustful. Having an affair was common, but it was also punishable by Swedish law. She was added to the so-called Register of Shame, and that's not to mention her upbringing. As a proud Lutheran girl, commandment number 6, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," must have rang over and over. This shame would have been immeasurable. In whatever case, it resulted in her becoming pregnant without a husband, and it all got even worse when her family found it. Beata had sadly died in 1864 of tuberculosis, but Gustav, her older sister Anna Christina, and her two younger brothers all severed ties. In the eyes of her family and the Lord, Elizabeth was dead. The humiliation continued, for on April 4th, 1865, it was discovered she had contracted syphilis from her unnamed lover. She was forced into a cure house, a place to treat those with venereal diseases, although it was more like a prison. People were pushed into cells until they were cured, and guards were freely able to beat and abuse individuals since they had broken the law. Elizabeth was treated with hydroiodic acid, which was common. On April 21st, while still in a cell, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby girl who never drew breath. She was born already dead, likely caused by the acid Elizabeth was forced to take. She was let out on May 13th with nowhere to go. She carried a likely fatal virus and was referred to as a harlot. Nobody would accept her. She couldn't even do legitimate work due to the Register of Shame, and now faced the option of either embracing prostitution or death. And she became what many said she was. She worked under an assumed name and moved from district to district, trying to make ends meet. Signs of her disease would come and go through different stages, and a proper cure was still decades away. Still, she was forced into cure houses 2 more times. The law didn't care about her, but the ordinary citizen did often feel sorrow. One of these people was Maria Ingrid Weisner, who was hired as a servant on November 10th. This got Elizabeth's name off the register of shame, but due to all the memories and the possibilities of running into an old client, she still wanted to move away from Gothenburg. With help from the Weisners and a mysterious donation of 65 crowns, Elizabeth packed her bags and sailed away to London. Maria Weisner likely hoped her life would improve significantly. Elizabeth would become a servant yet again, working in a wealthy household near Hyde Park, but she'd leave after another affair. She later became the servant of Elizabeth Bond, a wealthy widow. During an afternoon stop at a coffee house, Elizabeth met John Stride, son of the powerful landowner William Stride. John was a working carpenter and a pretty lonely man. They soon fell in love and were married on March 7, 1869, at St. Gillies in the Fields Church, which is actually the very same church Anne Bonny might have been baptized at almost 2 centuries prior. The couple would move to Poplar and open a coffee house, which wouldn't really last. It's likely that she never told John about her past, mostly out of shame. This past is also probably why she never had any children. The disease within her would affect pregnancy, and if the Lord demanded she never have a child, she would follow. In late 1873, John's father died. The vast majority of his family would inherit wealth and even Stride's Row, the land he had built up, but he got absolutely nothing. The marriage became unhappy, and Elizabeth, too, would turn to drinking. She briefly left in early 1877, where she took to the streets and was arrested as a vagrant, and then they reconciled and then separated again. And this would happen over and over. It was a never-ending pattern. During this period, Elizabeth found out a great way to make money. She claimed to be a survivor of the Princess Alice, a ship that had crashed into another vessel in 1878, killing 650 people. It'd get her enough money to live day by day, but not much more. Finally, in December of 1881, she'd part with John for the final time. She moved to Whitechapel, often staying at a lodge on 32 Flower and Dean Street. She worked as a chairwoman, a maid for families that couldn't afford one. Elizabeth was quite good at being people she wasn't. She told many stories to a point where she herself probably didn't even know who she was deep down. One day in 1883, a nearly blind woman named Mary Malcolm mixed up Elizabeth with her own sister, Elizabeth Watts. Elizabeth played along, and the two would see each other frequently until 1888. Often Mary would give Elizabeth money or clothing out of kindness. The following year, in October of 1884, John Stride would die of heart failure at 63. Elizabeth was both angry and sad, and it made her drinking habits much worse. She got into many fights and even briefly returned to prostitution. She'd soon move in with Michael Kidney, a man known for drinking, and it was about as bad as you'd expect. They fought constantly. She would leave, then always come back. By 1888, she was getting arrested quite frequently, partially due to drinking, but also due to her syphilis. The disease had entered the tertiary phase, which often affected the brain. Symptoms included epileptic fits, dementia, and erratic behavior. Elizabeth suffered through all of it. She didn't tell anyone these details. She didn't have friends, merely people who thought they knew her. She was quite the con woman, doing many underhanded tactics like holding a baby and claiming it was hers while begging. Still, these schemes were only the facade of a lonely woman who was falling apart in more ways than one. On September 26th, social reformer Thomas Bernardo saw Elizabeth talking with other women about the recent murders. She told him that all these people were up to good and nobody cared about them, and even questioned if people like her would be the next victims. September 29th began as a normal day for Elizabeth. She cleaned the rooms off the lodge and went to the Queen's Head pub for a drink, returning around 6:30 p.m. She had enough for a room, but still left the lodge at around 7. Was she going back to prostitution? Was she hoping to meet somebody new? Nobody knows why. Many people claimed to see her that night, but a simple glance at a woman near a door isn't strong evidence. The most likely sighting was at 12:45 a.m., where Israel Schwarz walked by Berner Street and caught a man arguing with a woman. This woman was thrown to the ground and cried for help. However, he kept walking, and saw a man emerge from the shadows and begin following him. This man yelled the word Lipsky, which was a reference to Israel Lipsky, a Jewish murderer who had been hanged the previous year and whose name was often an anti-Semitic insult. The poor woman was likely Elizabeth, although the identity of the attackers is unknown. odds are it was a gang robbery and not the infamous leather apron, although he was to appear on Burner Street soon enough.
I dusted off my clothes after the tussle those two gave me. Bloody hell! They took all the money I had. I might have to see Mary tonight just for a good bed. I knew going out late was a bad idea. I'm not going to find anyone to be sweet on at this hour. Damn it! I don't want to go back to Michael. Not this time. He won't change, but I would like to. Oh, Lord. Please let me change. I was once your humble servant, and part of me would like to return. I looked up at the sky, remembering back to the nights when the stars shine bright under the harvest. The memories felt blurry. They never happened, but I'm sure they did. I suddenly felt something jerk me backward. In a second I was on the ground looking up at someone. It was the fiend. Just as I began to scream, I felt something cut deep into my throat, and no sound came.
At 1 in the morning, a jewelry salesman named Louis Diemschutz was passing through Burner Street when his pony got startled by something. He got out and saw something close to a wall leading into Dutfield's yard. Upon a suspenseful inspection, his dim match revealed that there was a woman over there, but he couldn't make out any details. He brought over some people from a nearby club to help, but assumed she was either drunk or asleep, but upon getting closer, they saw blood flowing and knew she was dead immediately. In sheer horror, they realized that the killer had struck again. A crowd soon gathered, and law enforcement tried to keep people back until a doctor arrived. The first on station was Dr. Frederick William Blackwell, who arrived at 1:16 a.m. Dr. Phillips came 10 minutes later. The two noticed a knife wound across the throat that wasn't nearly as deep as previous murders, meaning that sadly, death probably was not instantaneous. The time of death was hard to say, anywhere between 12:46 a.m. and 12:56 a.m. Several members of the nearby educational club left between this time span, and none of them spotted a woman near a door. The body was also still warm to the touch. In all likelihood, the killing had happened moments before Louis Diemschutz had entered the street, and the culprit might still have been in Dutfield's yard when he was finding help in the club. This would also explain the lack of internal wounds, as the killer was likely scared off, but before the body could be moved to a morgue, the bell would toll for another lost soul. In the town of Wolverhampton, around April 14th of 1842, George and Catherine Eddows welcomed their 7th child. She was named Catherine, but preferred to go by Kate, and her family often called her Chick. George had been a tin worker at the old hall works for years, a difficult but decently paying job. George was also a key member of the Tin Man Society, a union for tin workers. In 1843, months after Kate was born, the society went on strike against the owner, Edward Perry. George was eventually found out to be the ringleader and was both fired and arrested by the police. He served 2 months in prison and soon after took his family and moved to London. For a family, a tin worker was a pretty sought-after job, but this family was huge. George had 11 brothers and Catherine would ultimately have 12 children, 10 out of which survived for a good length of time. It's not entirely clear why she had so many children, but whatever the case, they did their best to manage, and tried sending as many of them to school as possible, even the women. Literacy rate for women at the time was as low as 49%, but Kate would be one of the lucky ones. She was average at school and was described as entertaining and really passionate about singing. Unfortunately, her parents wouldn't do as well. Sadly, like everybody else we've mentioned, Kate too had to endure the horrors of tuberculosis. It took both her mother and father one after another, and Kate was put on a train back to Wolverhampton to stay with some aunts and uncles. Life back in Wolverhampton was not what Kate expected. After all of her schooling, she expected to be a servant, but was instead a scour, a tin forging job. This was a terrible job. She worked 6 days a week, often on 12-hour shifts, and her throat was often raw and eyes burned, and fatal accidents were regular occurrences. When she'd come home, she was forced to share a bed with a cousin as space was that tight. She didn't even have time to grieve for her parents, and sadly, like all the other victims before her, she too began drinking her sorrows away. In 1861, she was caught stealing at her job and was fired on the spot. Her surrogate parents no longer wanted her, and she moved into Birmingham to live with an uncle who made his living boxing. She really enjoyed her time with her uncle Tom Eddows. Watching boxing matches wasn't ladylike, but Kate never really was the weak church girl society wanted her to be. Despite this, he still had her working in a tin factory before too long, and she just didn't want this life. To sweat in an industrial area from sunrise to sundown for the rest of her life. That's when she met a soldier named Thomas Conway and found her ticket out of this life. Thomas was a former soldier born in Ireland who was sent home due to health problems. He was a Chapman, which was basically an old-timey salesman, and she'd end up joining him on the business, much to the dismay of her entire family. The pay wasn't great and she'd sleep out on the streets pretty often, but these would be some of her fondest years. Their dynamic often included them in the Tower Square. He would peddle his wares and she would sing the special-made songs. Kate became pregnant in 1863, and this was a major problem, because she wasn't officially married to him. Regardless, in April of that year, she checked herself into a workhouse infirmary to give birth. The conditions were unsanitary, but she had no choice. Her daughter Annie was born on the 18th and was healthy enough to travel with her parents. In 1866, the couple went to Staffordshire for a special occasion. Public executions were slowly on the way out, but when they did occur, it was big news. This one was unique. The man about to be hanged, Charles Christopher Robinson, was a cousin of Kate. Perhaps she felt sorry for him or related to his plight, which included being raised as an orphan. Kate wrote a ballad about the hanging, and it became such a hit that they were able to move into a home in London. Kate's sisters were shocked to see her again, and were even more shocked to see a tattoo of Conway's initials on her arm. Tattoos at the time were seen as a sign of sailors, criminals, and prostitutes. To Kate, it was just another way of not being forced to be a proper girl. By 1869, she lived close to Westminster and welcomed 2 more children into her life, Thomas and Harriet. Unfortunately though, in London, being a Chapman was much more common, so Conway struggled to find work and made ends meet as a bricklayer. Tragedy struck soon though, as her newborn child Harriet would suddenly pass away. She reported the death as caused by malnutrition, and Conway would soon leave the home to find work, leaving Kate alone with little to provide. And it was all downhill from here. She was knocking on the door to workhouses, which was something she never hoped to do. Her children were separated into different facilities and put in industrial schools, and Conway became incredibly abusive. He beat her constantly for drinking, and felt she was asking for it, all while her life crumbled more and more. She was arrested for drunken behavior, had another son by Christmas, and was still being abused through it all. She turned to her sister Emma for help, and while she did what she could, it wasn't enough. On Christmas Day, Kate's sisters found her with 2 black eyes. They were horrified, and while you'd think they'd intervene, they didn't. Kate's drinking worsened, and soon enough her sisters saw her as just as bad as Conway. On several occasions in the years that followed, Kate would walk into a square or road in London and leave her children behind without coming back. Police always had to return the children. In 1881, she finally left Conway once and for all, turning to her sisters for help, and then moving to a lodge after they refused. There she met John Kelly, a fruit seller who also happened to be a drunk, but thankfully wasn't violent. Her family saw him as even worse than Conway, but she was long past caring. Kate and John went around London looking for just about any odd job available, except prostitution. She never turned to this job. She frequently slept without a bed, and her own children despised her by this point, seeing her as a shell of herself. Her job searching continued until 1888, where she was now not in good health. She suffered from Bright's disease, possibly brought on by infection. Kate's last few days are a blur, since most of the information came from her drunk semi-husband. What we know is that they found work at the local Spitalfields market and made enough money for one of them to sleep at Cooney's, a lodge they frequented. John and Kate refused, although it's more likely he just took the money and paid for the bet himself. She slept on the sidewalk that night, and on the morning of September 30th, both of them were at Cooney's planning their day. At some point, the couple split up and went drinking, promising to meet back up by 4 p.m. This never happened. At 8:30 p.m., she was arrested by the police for being drunk. She was thrown in a cell and kept until 1 a.m., giving the police a false name, which she was used to. Kate wandered the streets in search of John, hoping he was still out drinking. Instead, he was back at Cooney's, having paid for a bed. After 20 minutes of searching, she gave up and started to look for a spot to sleep. Still somewhat drunk, she stumbled her way towards Meecher Square.
Come all you fleeting Christians, give ear unto my tale. It's for a cruel murder, I was hung at Stafford jail. In my hazy memory, I couldn't remember the rest of my own song. How many years ago did I pen it? Oh, my legs were tired. I bloody well hope John is still out. If he's in a warm bed, God above won't save him. I see the people I walk by give me that judgmental look. The same look when I showed off my tattoo. I'm not a daughter of the cloth, but I'm not Satan's whore either. Ah, there was a verse I remember now. Oh, Satan, thou demon strong, why didst on me bind? Oh, why did I allow my chain soon wrap my feeble mind? It was my best work. Not that Conway cared. I bet he claimed he wrote it now. Oh, where am I now? Ah, I think I know the square. The bobbies walk here quite often. Still, it's worth a few minutes of sleep. I laid away from the lamps as best as I could. I moved a couple of pocket items around, mostly the tin boxes. Tin. My mind filled with the bad memories of youth. But I didn't want to think about that. Like I always did when I wanted to forget, I sang. Whether you be rich or poor, your friends and sweethearts love, and God will crown your fleeting days with blessings from above. With a good song still on my lips, I drifted off to sleep. I then felt the presence of another, and then nothingness.
Police Constable Edward Watkins had been tasked with patrolling Meecher Square that lonely night. At 1:30 a.m., he entered the square and saw nothing. At 1:41 a.m., Constable James Harvey reached Meecher Square. But because of the darkness, he didn't see anything strange. At 1:44 a.m., Watkins completed his patrol and re-entered the square, only to see a woman dead in the corner. He could see multiple wounds across the face and body, organs protruding, and pools of blood even without much light. Watkins ran for assistance, getting the attention of a night watchman. When the doctors arrived, they were shocked. These wounds were even ghastlier than the others so far. A wound to the neck had been fatal like all the others, but she had stomach wounds everywhere. Entire organs were pulled out, and some of them were just straight up missing. She had stab wounds in her eyes and her nose was cut off. It was determined that this murder had taken place between 1:35 a.m. to 1:40 a.m., and the injuries took at least 5 minutes to do. Constable Harvey had likely entered the square with the killer still present, he just didn't know it. As Kate was taken to a morgue, police under Major Henry Smith continued to patrol the streets for the killer. Nobody found him, but something else was found that night. At 2:55 a.m., as police tore up Meecher Square and Burner Street, Constable Alfred Long found a torn piece of an apron in Goulston Street. It belonged to Kate. Nearby was a message written in chalk. Soon even Commissioner Sir Charles Warren was at the crime scene, trying to make sense of what happened. He was quickly briefed about the two murders, the apron and the message, and he and his superintendent agreed that something had to be done. Their decision was to destroy the message, to ensure the public wouldn't reach a state of pandemonium, blaming the Jews once again and possibly leading to a riot. No picture was taken, and like that, the message became history. The sun rose on a shattered London, 2 murders in a single night. Police continued to search in vain, doctors did their best to find evidence on the bodies, and the citizens were petrified. Autopsies were done soon after, and for the Elizabeths, there wasn't much to say, other than the knife likely being a bootmaker's knife, just like Polly's murder. For Kate, though, Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown was sure someone with considerable understanding of the human body had performed the murder, but other doctors disagreed with this. Kate was identified by John and her sisters very quickly, as despite all the wounds, she was still herself. But Elizabeth still wasn't identified until the end of October. Something else had come up that took priority for the police. The Central News Agency had gotten another letter. They sent it to Scotland Yard like the previous one. It gave the following message.
I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you tip.
You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow.
Double vent this time. No one squealed, but couldn't finish straight off.
Had not time to get ears off for police.
Thanks for keeping the last letter back till I got to work again.
Jack the Ripper.
The aforementioned cutting of the ear was present in the previous letter, and doctors reported that a segment of Kate's ear had been damaged. Police decided that they had no choice but to release both letters to the public on October 3rd in hopes someone would identify the writings, and from here on out, he'd forever be known as Jack the Ripper. The events of September 30th, as the letter said, were also forever known as the double event. In the end, nobody recognized the handwriting, and hundreds of fake letters were sent in by various people instead. Privately, the police still questioned if the notes were authentic. Elizabeth wouldn't be identified until October 2nd, when Swedish priest Sven Olsen came in and resolved the matter. It took some convincing, but it was clear that he was the only person who knew her life story and real name. She had confided in him when nobody else was deemed trustworthy. He gave her a hymn book, and despite it being worth some money, she always held on to it. It was found among her possessions, confirming this connection. The media frenzy in the wake of the double event and the published letters was insatiable. Newspapers printed rumors, making connections to past murders like Smith and Tabram, as well as unrelated murders like the Thame Torso murders, among many others. This is also where the infamous look of Jack the Ripper began. Many people were interviewed who claimed to have seen him, and the majority of identifications were flat out wrong, but they stuck through history forever. Matthew Packer was a fruit salesman who claimed a well-dressed man in a black coat and top hat entered his shop, with a woman he was sure was Elizabeth. He told his story many times, but it's clear he was making it all up for publicity, as he kept changing details as time went on. There was also Fanny Mortimer, who told the press she had seen a man with a big black bag leaving Burner Street after Elizabeth's murder. It later turned out that this man was a member of the Education Club, and was most certainly not the killer. But the image of a man in a black coat, a top hat, and a black doctor bag persisted through the newspapers and remains to this day the popular image of Jack. Some more plausible sightings came forward as well. Joseph Lawand and two friends claimed to have spotted a woman near Mutre Square at 1:35 a.m. that night with what looked like a sailor, like Elizabeth long before him. However, the glance was so brief that we can't be sure he saw anything worth noting. Days after the murder, the scenes were filled with people wanting to see where the innocent women were killed. Youthful men lunged at women with knives as a horrible joke, and prostitutes went to other places. Accusations were also rampant, as a local stage actor, Richard Mansfield, was accused of being the Ripper after a production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde convinced audiences he wasn't acting. Weapons were also sold on streets for very low prices. Eventually, on October 6th, Elizabeth Stride was finally buried, with just one person in attendance, Sven Olsen. Her family perhaps never learned that she died, and he felt she deserved to have someone attend. She had been so many things in life, so many jobs, so many roles, from a church girl to a prostitute, a shipwreck survivor, and a blind woman's sister. She had been the type of woman Victorian society judged harshly, and a lost lady hoping to be better. Olsen would likely have admitted she wasn't perfect, but she was more than a victim and deserved respect all the same. Nobody deserves to be alone when the end finally comes. Kate Eddows, on the other hand, had a massive funeral when she was finally buried, on October 8th. As many as 500 people came out to bid her farewell. Many remaining members of the Eddows clan across England also came out to bid Kate a fond farewell. Although they had done little to help her in her darkest hour, they felt compelled to pay for her entire funeral, perhaps out of guilt for not doing enough. While never close, John Kelly and Kate's sisters embraced each other for the only time in mourning. Her children came out to forgive the only mother they ever knew. Songs were sung as the woman once known as Chick to her family was lowered into the ground. For a short while, all of Whitechapel mourned the loss of a woman they mostly didn't know, but would have likely loved if given a chance. After the funeral, all eyes were on the London police, as people did not think they were doing nearly enough to catch this killer. Truly, they did all they could. They sent more constables, investigated thousands of people, and arrested many too. The case was making international news. The largest empire on Earth couldn't catch one killer in its capital. Suggestions such as bloodhounds and arresting any woman seen after dark were given, but thankfully they didn't happen. People like Inspector Aberline worked for days without sleep and food, always hoping for a break and the case was near. All the while, the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee and similar organizations continued hunting the streets for a monster. On October 16th, George Lusk received a package with his name on it. The package contained a box and a letter. The letter reads as follows.
From out, Mr. Lusk, sir.
I sent you half the kidney I took from one woman.
Presented for you to the pigs I fried and ate. It was very nice.
I might send you the bloody knife that took it out, if only you wait a while longer.
Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
Inside the box was a part of a kidney, preserved in wine. It was taken to a doctor and later police, and everyone was truly unsure as to if this was a prank or not. The note's writing style didn't at all resemble the Dear Boss and Saucy Jack letters. This incident made its way into the press, which was naturally a huge deal when the news broke, but it subsided soon after. All was quiet. Even on Halloween night, he didn't appear. It was thought to be over once again. Charles Warren had had enough, though. He resigned as commissioner of the London police on November 8th, the day before one more woman would cruelly perish. Mary Jane Kelly is by far the most famous of the 5 women. In almost every film or book adaptation, she's the victim with the most screen time, which is ironic as she has the least known information out of everyone. She was only 25 upon her death, meaning she was probably born in 1863. She claimed to have been born in Limerick, Ireland, before moving to England with 8 siblings. Her father was the foreman of an ironworks factory. She married a coal miner and eventually became a high-class prostitute. That's the story she usually told, but she also claimed to be Welsh, had a child, and was related to an unnamed stage actress in the West End. She sometimes also went by the French name Marie Jeanette Kelly. Birth records in Wales and Ireland don't turn up anyone named Mary Jane or Mary Jeanette, meaning the name she told friends and customers was probably fake. We do know she likely came from a high-class background, as she was known to draw and paint. These talents were never taught to working-class girls, only those of a higher class. Those who knew her never described her as having an Irish or Welsh accent, but they did describe her as very proper and well-dressed. She arrived in London in either 1883 or 84, and lived in the West End, which was a very high-class section of the city. It's unclear exactly how she became a prostitute, but whatever the case, she did, and prostitution was very different here. In a high-class area like this, prostitution did not involve walking the streets at night, but instead involved being in ballroom dances and dinner meetings. Someone like Mary Jane was indistinguishable from a typical high-class lady at a glance. Piccadilly Circus and Leicester Square were very much the heart of prostitution in the West End. Mary Jane knew these locations well and made much more money than the previous 4 ladies. She, in particular, loved owning fancy dresses. But of course, the life of a prostitute is never easy. At one point, Mary Jane fell for a Frenchman who offered her a trip to Paris. But strangely, she rarely spoke of this event, instead simply saying it went poorly. In all likelihood, she was probably referring to the unfortunately common sex trafficking trade, where rich men took girls from across Europe to work against their will. She escaped this life, but such trauma is rarely forgotten. When Mary Jane returned, she decided not to return to the high-class West End, but instead went to a lodging house on Radcliffe Highway, a major downgrade. The place was well known as a prostitute haven, since arrests were rare here. She was forced out eventually. The lodge owner described her as kind when sober, but aggressive when drunk. While moving around, she met someone who claimed to be her father, but she was absolutely terrified, and to this day, we have absolutely no idea why. In early 1887, she fell in love with a man named Joseph Fleming, but this would not last long at all. He was violent, and she had no tolerance for such behavior. After a little while, she'd moved to a place all too familiar, Whitechapel. She'd actually become well known here, as she'd frequently tell stories of the West End, London, Scotland, among other things at the 10 Bells pub. She also became known for buying people drinks and singing. This was all when sober, of course. When drunk, she was much different. Really, this fun and easygoing persona was a mask. It wasn't the real Mary Jane. She once confided in another woman that she was sick of the life she led. In March of 1888, she met and fell in love with a man named Joseph Barnett. They'd moved many times and would get along for a while, mostly due to the money he earned as a fish porter. They eventually ended up in a one-room building at 13 Miller's Court. The two had to deal with a terrible landlord named John McCarthy, but they remained happy together. Of course, this relationship too would turn sour in time. After losing his job, they began arguing constantly. They fell short on money, and Mary Jane had to walk the streets again. By October, the Ripper murders were making headlines, and many prostitutes feared they'd be next, as police claimed he targeted women like them, and at the time, there was no proof to the contrary. Mary Jane read about the case almost daily, and actually allowed women to stay in her room from time to time to make them feel safe, much to the dismay of Barnett. By the end of the month, he moved out, although he still cared for her greatly. He last saw Mary Jane on the evening of November 8th. The two parted on decent terms, likely expecting to see each other again in the near future. Alas, it was to be the last night Mary Jane spent on Earth. Mary Jane's last hours were somewhat well documented. A woman named Mary Ann Cox saw her with a man around 11:45 a.m. She shouted goodnight to Mary Jane, who responded with the same reply. A little later, she could be heard singing the first verse of the song, "A Violet Plunked from My Mother's Grave When a Boy." She was still singing around 1 in the morning. A nearby tenant named Elizabeth Prater said it stopped around 1:30 a.m. Further sightings that night claimed Mary Jane was on the streets around 2 to 3 a.m., and one person even claimed she was alive at 8:30 a.m., but these sightings are difficult to verify. A man named George Hutchinson famously claimed he stalked Mary Jane and an unknown man to her home at 2:45 in the morning. But his story is full of holes. In all reality, it's plausible Mary Jane Kelly went to sleep sometime around 1:30 in the morning after singing for hours. She probably sent her customer home and closed the door, which locked by itself. She folded her clothing and put them away, nothing quite as lovely as her fancy dresses, but they were good enough. She got into bed and with a single candle lit, tried to sleep through the rain-heavy night.
In my dreams, they're always coming. I run, but they always catch me. Like wolves, they drag me back. I don't feel shame about what I do, but those people make me ashamed to be who I am. Maybe I should move on again. Another building, another town. But then poor Joseph would be heartbroken. I should move on from him, but the thought brings me nothing but sorrow. I just cannot quit him. Perhaps I should tell him the truth about who I am. Oh, but the truth is a scary thing. It's my burden, my pain, my problem. At that moment, I heard the door open. The room was too dark. I couldn't see who it was. Joseph? The traffickers? He walked quickly, and I saw the knife he was holding. It was the Ripper! I threw up my hands and screamed murder. I felt a sharp pain in my right hand. Before I could do anything, he swung again, and everything went black.
At 10:45 a.m. the following day, Thomas Bowers, a former soldier working for John McCarthy, knocked on Mary Jane's room demanding rent money. He went to the window and swept aside a curtain, expecting to see her hiding. Instead, he bore witness to one of the ghastliest crime scenes in British history. He saw a body on the bed, completely unrecognizable. He panicked and ran to the nearby police station. Detective Walter Dew was on station. Bowers told him the Ripper had struck again. Dozens of people converged on Miller's Court, including Inspector Aberline and Dr. Phillips. Among them was a new face, Surgeon Thomas Bond. Most of these people were here by 11:30, but Dr. Phillips waited until the door was pried open with a pickaxe at 1:30. He had already looked through the window. He knew what awaited. Mary Jane Kelly's body was in a condition that words fail to describe. Her throat had been cut like the other women, but the post-mortem abuse was far worse. There were so many cuts and wounds that we don't know the exact number. Entire sections of the body had been lacerated. Her face had been so damaged that you could barely see human features. Her breasts had been cut off and organs were placed all over the bed. Even the most hardened of surgeons couldn't stomach the sight. In the fireplace was some burnt clothing. The killer had likely taken some of Mary Jane's dresses and burned them for a light source. Establishing a time of death was difficult, anywhere between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. Elizabeth Prater and another woman, Sarah Lewis, soon claimed during interviews that they heard a woman cry, "murder," around 4 in the morning. She had put up a fight, judging by defensive wounds to the right hand and forearm. Later in the morgue, Joseph Barnett identified Mary Jane only through her hair and eyes. He also explained how the killer got in. He probably reached through the broken window and opened up the door latch. Dr. Bond wrote down that the mutilations likely at least took 2 hours to perform. Just like after the double event, London was in a state of terror, so much so that even Queen Victoria was horrified and demanded Prime Minister Lord Salisbury do something. The following day, Thomas Bond wrote what is generally considered the first ever criminal profile. He wrote an 11-point paper on all 5 murders and concluded several key details. Stuff like how each victim was lying down at the moment of their death, how the throat was always cut from left to right, how the victim did little to fight back, indicating surprise attacks, and how the knife in question was sharp and straight like a butcher's knife. The most controversial point was point number 8. In each case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer, or any person accustomed to cut up dead animals. Mary Jane was buried November 19th. The crowd that attended her funeral was over 1,000 people. Barnett was one of them, alongside some of the women she had helped keep safe. She died having never been honest about her life, but her actions gave away who she was. She had her demons and her faults, but she was never above helping her fellow man. Many in the crowd never knew her, but plenty probably did. They remembered the young woman who told stories and seemed full of life. It might have been a mask, but it was one hell of a persona. What her real name was and where she came from, in the end, it doesn't matter. The inscription on her grave best described her. None but the lonely hearts can know my sadness. Love lives forever. Time passed and the fear of the Ripper soon began to dissipate. But this time, he didn't come back. 1888 came to a close, and the most wanted man in the United Kingdom hadn't been seen in weeks. Murders did occur afterwards, but police concluded they weren't related. By 1889, groups like the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee dissolved, and police stopped patrolling the East End. Much as people had tried, justice for 5 innocent women wasn't going to be served. By the turn of the century, Whitechapel was unrecognizable. Much of it was torn down or paved over. Locations were renamed, people were forcibly removed. Those who worked the case and knew the victims went their separate ways. Some moved on, some never could. Case files were eventually taken home or thrown out to make space for solvable crimes. And some evidence even went up in smoke during the London Blitz. The sensational stories faded into memory. Memory became myth. Over the years, Jack's legacy would build, and he'd often get compared when discussing other horrible killers like the Moon Murderers or the Yorkshire Ripper. However, the man described wasn't mortal anymore. He was whatever society wanted him to be. A symbol of the rich eating the poor, the violent psychopath, the uncontrollable foreigner, a boogeyman meant to scare children. While Jack's legend grew larger, the graves of Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Kate, and Mary Jane grew withered and old. Just crosses and stones from a different time. Forgotten relics from a bygone era. Sometimes just unmarked holes in the ground. Britain cries for its fallen monarchs and its proud soldiers. But few still wept for 5 daughters of the Industrial Revolution, doomed as much by governmental policy as by the hand of a serial killer. Their voices were forever silenced on a cold autumn night. Here we stand now tonight. 133 years removed. Everyone who lived in London from that time is now long gone. But one citizen has gained immortality. He has no face, but his actions have echoed for decades. Many murderers have taken his name, but none remain as infamous. Who was this individual? Who was Jack the Ripper? Before we look at our unending wall of suspects, we must ask a few questions. Firstly, how many women did he kill? This is a surprisingly contested question. Police at the time mostly felt it was 5 victims, although plenty of officials and constables did think other murders were possibly connected. 11 women were murdered in Whitechapel from 1888 to 1891, starting with Emma Smith and ending with Frances Cole. Some of these murders were clearly someone else. Smith was beaten to death, the before-mentioned Martha Tabram was stabbed 39 times with what appears to be a bayonet and a knife. Later victims like Cole at first looked like Ripper victims, but might have been killed by copycats. Mutilations weren't consistent. MOs differed in small but meaningful ways. Although we can't get into details about women like Smith, Tabram, and Cole, they are just as deserving of respect as the 5. All of them lived tragic lives and deserve to be remembered as more than a statistic. Other possible connections to the Ripper include the Whitehall mystery, a murder victim found near the soon-to-be-constructed new Scotland Yard building. Missing a head and other limbs, there was also a series of dismembered bodies dumped into the River Thames that became known as the Thames Torso Murders. These weren't connected to Jack. The MO is radically different. These women were sadly killed by another uncaught serial killer. Some have argued Elizabeth and Mary Jane weren't Ripper victims due to the notably different post-mortem wounds. Elizabeth's lack of injuries is due to the killer being scared off. The intensity of police searches possibly forced Jack to go after someone indoors, resulting in Mary Jane's horrific death. Or perhaps he was psychologically falling apart and was getting progressively more violent. Regardless, we must presume that the Ripper killed 5 women and then mysteriously vanished soon after. Now, was he a doctor? This is the most pressing question as it narrows the suspect list considerably. At the time, medical personnel were very mixed. Dr. Phillips was adamant that the cuts done to Annie and Kate were something only someone with medical knowledge could do. Dr. Llewellyn felt the killer of Polly had some level of anatomical understanding. On the other hand, Dr. George William Sequeira and Medical Officer William Sedgwick Saunders, 2 individuals who presided over Kate's autopsy, were sure the wounds were random and not precise. Dr. Bond, we feel, has the final word. He was the most experienced medical official involved in the case, and he strongly felt the killer had no understanding of surgery. Another reason is the location. Medical doctors were never lower-class citizens, and people like that didn't live in Whitechapel by and large. Those that did were immediately investigated and cleared. The killer knew Whitechapel well, information a rich man wouldn't have. In our opinion, the Ripper could have been a butcher, a tailor, a leather maker, or just someone who had easy access to a knife, but little else. He wouldn't have had a top hat or a fancy coat. He would have looked like anyone you'd see on the streets of Whitechapel. Speaking of knives, what type of blade was used in the murders? Well, it seemed to vary depending on the murder. A bootmaker's knife was presumed by Dr. Llewellyn and Dr. Phillips as the weapon used to kill Polly and Elizabeth. A butcher's knife or slaughterman's knife was the assumed weapon that took Annie and Kate's life. Mary Jane's couldn't be narrowed down beyond probably having a 6-inch blade. It's plausible the killer used a couple types of knives. It wasn't hard to obtain a knife in Whitechapel, through legal or illegal methods. All we can gather is that the knives were usually around 6 inches long or more, and the blade was straight. How old was Jack? Thomas Bond referred to him as possibly middle-aged, but he could plausibly have been somewhat young. Since there was no definitive sighting, the age ranges from 20 to 40. It's unlikely the killer was an old man due to the amount of energy used during the post-mortem attacks, but beyond that, little can be ruled out. Why did he stop? Impossible to say for sure. Some serial killers do retire, like the Golden State Killer, but someone like Jack was unlikely to do the same. The only reason the murder stopped is because he moved away, was captured for something unrelated, or died. Odds are it's the latter two, as no other city reported similar murders. Did he write those letters? They're some of the most famous aspects of the case. He was one of the first serial killers to taunt the police, setting up future killers like Zodiac or the BTK killer. But remember, the police were pretty sure they were false, even after the double event. It's because the letters were sent to a central news agency, not the police or a newspaper. This is a strange place to send a boastful letter meant to intimidate someone. It's also the type of place a journalist would send a letter, not a working class man in Whitechapel. The note also promised things that never happened, such as sending a pair of ears to the police. The writing was also quite theatrical, closer to the writing style of a professional author more than anything else. Making matters worse, recent handwriting experts have discovered multiple similarities between writing styles in both the Dear Boss and Saucy Jackie letters. Saucy Jackie is interesting, as it seems to be taking credit for the double event of September 30th, which at first glance looks to be solid evidence. It was sent prior to the murders, right? Nope. The postmark date was October 1st. More than enough time to learn details about the crime. While Kate suffered some damage to an ear, it wasn't cut off like the letter promised. Likely a lucky guess from the writer. Now, if it was a journalist, why send in fake letters? Well, it sure would boost newspaper sales, and without a doubt, sales did skyrocket. The author's identity is still unknown, although police felt fairly strong that Tom Bullen of the Central News Agency was the writer of the letters. They just couldn't arrest him since they didn't have substantial evidence. In the 1930s, another man, Fred Best, admitted he wrote the letters. Whether this was the truth or he wanted attention, we can't say. Lastly, if the letters were fake, this means the name Jack the Ripper was actually fake. Where did a writer come up with that name? Ripper is easy to figure. He was tearing apart his victims. Jack is more intriguing, a relatively common name, but probably drawing from two individuals. Jack Shepherd was a famous thief and prison escapee from the 1700s who became popular due to an 1839 novel. He inspired a lot of plays and books, making the name Jack quite popular. But there is another legend named Jack that is closer in tone to the Ripper. Spring-heeled Jack was a folkloric creature from the 1830s. A demon monster who could leap buildings and attack women. His legend was still quite strong in 1888, and certainly someone a writer would be familiar with. So, Dear Boss, Saucy Jackie, and even the name Jack the Ripper were fake. What about the From Hell letter? Its writing style is vastly different than any of the others, and it came with a kidney. Well, at first glance, it looks pretty genuine. The writing is cramped, deranged, not remotely fancy. There are numerous misspellings, and the note never says it's from Jack. But there's one fundamental problem. The spelling doesn't seem authentic. The beginning spells the word Mr. correctly, but at the end it spells it as Mishter. The grammar also doesn't quite match someone spelling a word as it sounds. Knife has a silent K, but the letter spells it as KNIF. Similarly, the word while has a silent H, but it's spelled WHIL. It comes across more like an educated person trying to write like someone who can't spell. The kidney is also a problem. While some people claim it came from a woman in her mid-40s, that really couldn't be guessed with modern medicine at the time. Kidneys do change due to age and gender, but the differences are minor. They certainly had been taken from a human corpse, but that's all we can conclude. George Lusk wasn't the most popular person, and it's not impossible that a medical student played a prank on him by taking a kidney from a recent corpse and sent it to him. After all, Lusk lived at 1 Alderney Road, Mile End, which was only a mile away from London Hospital. While at least more plausible when compared to Dear Boss and Saucy Jackie, we feel confident when we say none of the Ripper letters were genuine. Finally, what about the Golston Street graffiti? Did Jack write that? Well, what's the meaning of the message? The Jews are the men that will be blamed for nothing is broken English. Some writers have noted it's written in a double negative style, something you find pretty often in the Cockney language. A plausible translation is, Jews will not take responsibility for anything. Anti-Semitic writing was common in London, and a working-class man feeling he had been ripped off would often leave such degrading messages. In all likelihood, it wasn't connected to the murder. It was pure chance that Kate's apron was tossed near it, rather than any sinister reason. So what are we looking for? An individual anywhere from 20 to 40 living in Whitechapel, works a job that includes using a knife in day-to-day business. He likely didn't have any medical knowledge, was working class and never sent in letters. He displayed a sadistic hatred of women, and after November 1888, he suddenly vanished. Does this description fit any of the well-known suspects? There are literally hundreds of Ripper suspects, some we have already discussed. The finger of suspicion has fallen on people like Charles Cross, the man who found poor Polly, or Joseph Barnett, the boyfriend of Mary Jane. Claims like these are absurd. Cross lived until 1920 and never moved anywhere. His only tie to the case was finding one victim and sometimes going by the name Charles Lechmere. Barnett is even more unlikely, since he deeply cared about Mary Jane and would never have killed her. Barnett eventually stopped grieving, got married to another woman, and died in 1926. Barnett also never left London. The Ripper wasn't the sort of person to just stop. There needs to be a solid reason the killing ceased. First on the legitimate suspect list is Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a barrister who worked as a teacher in London, and was overall unremarkable. He was fired from his job in late 1888 and was found in the River Thames sometime in December. Mental illness and suicide sadly ran in his family. His mother was institutionalized, and several close members took their own lives. Why is he a suspect? Because his death coincided with the end of the murders. That's it. It's a real mystery why Sir Melville Macnaghten named him as a suspect in a memorandum. He didn't work the case when it was active. He was made Assistant Chief Constable in 1889. Druitt had no history of violence, he didn't live in Whitechapel, and he might even have an alibi for a couple of the murders. He wasn't the Ripper. Another suspect Macnaghten had was a Russian named Michael Ostrog, a notable conman and fraudster. His police record is quite long, and he was definitely a career criminal, someone who just loved to steal and cheat, but he was never tied to a single murder, and worse, he was in prison in France during the entire Ripper murders. He was still alive as late as 1904, and it was quite obvious he wasn't the killer. One man who most certainly was a killer is Surin Kolowski, also known as George Chapman. No relation to Annie. Chapman was a Polish immigrant who lived in London as a barber. He was definitely in England around 1888, but he later moved to the United States. Chapman was an aggressive man. He beat his multiple wives and even murdered them via poison. He was caught in 1903 for killing 3 of his wives and quickly hanged. He was the favorite suspect of Inspector Aberline, and it's possible to see why. A convicted murderer now classified as a serial killer who came and left England and was eventually hanged looks pretty good. There is, however, an issue, and it's something Aberline couldn't have understood. Chapman was a poisoner. As we have said when talking about the Zodiac and Axemen of New Orleans, serial killers rarely changed MOs. Going from poison to a knife is a dramatic change, and there isn't really a killer on record who did this. This also eliminates similar suspects like Thomas Neal Cream. A poisoner wasn't the Ripper. Francis Tumbley was the favorite suspect of Inspector John Littlechild. He was a quack doctor from Ireland, the type that could claim he had the power to cure cancer and various ailments. He was quite the absurd character, dressing like a military officer and sporting a prominent mustache. Tumbley moved from the US to London during the murders and eventually fled England to avoid charges of indecent exposure. He was gay, which sadly was a crime back in the 1880s. He kept moving around until he died in 1903. Now, he's a somewhat popular suspect because he came and left at the right time for the murders to begin and stop. He was well known to hate women, and there was a story that he carried female organs in jars, organs similar to those taken from Kate. But despite his misogyny, he wasn't known to be particularly violent. He didn't know Whitechapel at all, and a man as distinct as him would stand out like a sore thumb. Also, the story of his organ collection may have been a fabrication to sell more newspapers. Interesting at first glance, but the only objective relation to the Ripper he had was ripping off people with fake medicine. Another suspect is Thomas Hayne Cutbush, a 22-year-old medical student at the time of the murders. In later years, he would contract syphilis, at least that's what the newspapers claim. It's unclear if he ever really did. While he didn't live in Whitechapel, he did spend a lot of time wandering the streets. In 1891, he stabbed 2 women non-fatally and was sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, where he died in 1903. In 1896, he was accused of being the Ripper by the infamous newspaper The Sun. Macnaghten's memorandum was actually written to counter The Sun claiming the Ripper was Cutbush. Which is all fair to us. The man was still free until 1891, and whoever the killer was, he vanished or died shortly after November 1888. It was never Cutbush. The newspapers just saw someone with problems who attacked women. Nothing more. Another man associated with Broadmoor was James Kelly. Kelly was an upholsterer with an aggressive temper. In 1883, he murdered his wife by cutting her throat. He was taken to Broadmoor instead of being hanged, where he eventually escaped in 1888. He wasn't seen again until 1927, where he seemingly turned himself in, living another 2 years. This is an angry individual with known hatred towards women, violent enough to kill. His one known victim died in a similar enough manner to the 5, and he cannot be traced at all in 1888. This does mean, though, he can't be proven to be in Whitechapel around those critical months, and he was still on the loose until 1927. Nothing would have stopped him from killing if he was the Ripper, so while an interesting suspect, he couldn't have been Jack. Now on to the most famous theory concerning Jack the Ripper, the Royal Conspiracy Theory. It's a doozy. While some people had suspected a member of the royal family was behind the murder for years, this explanation exploded in 1976 following the publishing of Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution. It claimed that the killer was Sir William Gull, the physician to Queen Victoria, who went around London killing 5 women who bore witness to the marriage of her grandson, Prince Albert Victor, and a girl named Annie Crook. Because she was Catholic, the royal line would end, so this marriage had to be covered up. Gull was given the task alongside painter Walter Sickert and coachman John Netley. Also, Montague Jewett was murdered and framed. Also, they were all Freemasons. Also, the police were in on the murders and covered it up. Yes, this is seriously what the book claims. This wasn't a joke. There are also variations of this theory that have Prince Albert as the killer or just Walter Sickert. Knight got all this information from a man claiming to be Sickert's illegitimate son, and he recanted everything a couple of years later. Not that anyone should have waited for that revelation. The entire theory is comically absurd. None of the victims knew each other. William Gull was 71 and had suffered a recent stroke. The grandson of Victoria marrying a Catholic girl wouldn't end the royal bloodline. The Freemasons aren't an all-seeing, all-knowing cult. This theory is likely best known to people as the plot to the beloved Alan Moore graphic novel, From Hell. Moore, for the record, thought it was a stupid theory. He just believed it could make a good story. The god-awful 2001 film adaptation with Johnny Depp missed the memo, as it takes this speculation quite seriously. The fact this theory is still so popular to this day says a lot about Ripperology. I don't even need to say none of these people were Jack the Ripper. You should probably already know that. Ripper popularity was at a high point in the 1990s, following the 100th anniversary, and this is when the world first met James Maybrick. Maybrick was a somewhat wealthy cotton merchant from Liverpool who traveled to the US and back for business reasons. In 1889, he died rather suddenly. It was quickly deduced he had been poisoned. His wife was accused of murder, found guilty, and later exonerated in a very public trial. This all sounds like nothing, and it is, until 1992 when his diary was supposedly found. It seems to admit he was Jack the Ripper. The journal claims to answer a lot of questions. The name Jack came from the J.A. from James and C.K. from Maybrick. He killed the 5 because he caught his wife cheating on him. Some people took this seriously, but a lot of people were immediately skeptical of these claims. Among the people who looked into the authenticity was the famous skeptic Joel Nichols. The conclusions were not promising. The writing style was more 20th century than 19th century. The ink might have been from the 1970s. The book was conveniently missing pages. Details didn't match the crime scenes. The handwriting didn't match Maybrick's penmanship. In 1995, the man who found the diary confessed to forging it. He later recanted, but the damage was already done. While some people will still claim it's legitimate, it most certainly isn't. Besides, a Liverpool merchant who died in 1889 with no history of violence is a pretty poor suspect. All he has is this diary as evidence, and it's pretty lousy evidence at that. There are dozens of other theories, from claiming known serial killers like H.H. Holmes or the servant girl annihilator was Jack to accusations that famous authors like Lewis Carroll were the killer. There's an entire belief that Jack was really a woman, a Jill the Ripper, if you will. This theory was considered by the police briefly, but gained notoriety when it was brought up by none other than Sherlock Holmes creator Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It doesn't hold any water, and usually rests on some pretty sexist beliefs that women who can't have kids want to murder women who can. We could go on, but you get the point. Many suspects who all fall apart when you look closely, but there are two suspects that looked very promising. There was one more name in McNaughton's memorandum that we didn't mention yet. He said the killer might have been a Polish Jew named Kosminski, who deeply hated women and was known to be quite violent. He lived in the center of the area where all 5 murders were committed and lived alone. He was taken to an insane asylum in 1889, coinciding with the murder's ending. Normally just being listed in this memorandum wouldn't mean much. Druitt and Ostrog were utterly worthless suspects, but this Kosminski shows up in a couple of other spots. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson claimed he was positive he knew who the Ripper was, and in his 1910 memoirs said the killer was a low-class Polish Jew who was seen by a witness but couldn't be arrested. The witness refused to testify out of fear of causing an anti-Semitic riot. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson also added the suspect was named Kosminski. He was sent to Colney Hatch, a famous asylum in London, where he soon died in 1889. Multiple key police members claim they thought a suspect, who happened to be a violent woman-hating local later sent to an asylum who soon died, was the Ripper, is truly something. Decades later, the records of Colney Hatch were looked over, and only one Kosminski was found, Aaron Kosminski. Aaron Kosminski was born in Poland and fled his native land after the assassination of Russian Tsar Alexander II. He moved to Whitechapel along many other Jewish refugees, becoming a barber. He lived with some family in 1888. He hadn't been working for quite some time. He lived at 3 Sion Square and later 16 Greenfield Street. He was mentally ill and, at one point, threatened a sibling with a knife. He was indeed transferred to the asylum, where he spent the rest of his life. This is all pretty solid stuff. Adding to the mix in 2019, a peer-reviewed paper found DNA evidence linking him to Kate's murder. This seems open and shut, right? Yeah, it's too good to be true. There are several significant issues with claiming Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. While he did suffer from psychological problems, they mostly came in the form of refusing food and bathing. Outside of threatening his sister once, he wasn't violent, not even when in the asylum. The date of his arrest is also a problem. It wasn't right after the murders. It was in 1891. He also didn't die in 1889. He died in 1919. The DNA results are also very controversial because they came from a shawl, something never reported by the police at Kate's murder, an item she couldn't afford. It also relied on mitochondria DNA, which can't match a suspect, only eliminate one. The sample was also over 100 years old, so its value is pretty much nothing. The DNA evidence is frankly as useful as the fake Ripper diary. Aaron Kosminski might be the most popular suspect right now, but despite looking so good at first, he probably wasn't Jack the Ripper. That being said, London police were definitely talking about someone in those files and memorandums. They never said Aaron Kosminski, they merely said Kosminski. Is it possible they were talking about someone else? This final theory I owe to the late Martin Fido, who proposed what I feel is the best Jack the Ripper suspect. Is it possible the police were talking about a different suspect and merely got the name wrong? These references to an arrest in late 1888 and death in 1889 cannot be mixed up with Aaron Kosminski. He was still alive when all this information was written up. Was there a person with a similar name living in Whitechapel who can be traced to Colney Hatch? In 1888, at 15 Black Lion Yard, an area within walking distance of all the murders, was a man named Nathan Kaminsky. He was a 23-year-old Polish immigrant who had moved to England sometime around 1887, maybe earlier. Aaron Kosminski was also 23. Nathan was a bootmaker. He worked in the leather trade. In March of that year, he was diagnosed with syphilis. It was supposedly cured by May, but as we discussed earlier, it's not a disease you genuinely get rid of. Treatment of syphilis in men was similar to the horrible acid treatment Elizabeth went through, but it also often included injecting mercury via syringe into the penis. Someone going through such treatment wouldn't forget how they got the disease, which could lead to an intense anger. After treatment, Nathan seemed to vanish from all records, but a couple of months later, in December, a man named David Cohen was found wandering the streets of Whitechapel. He was first taken to Whitechapel Infirmary on December 12th, but he proved incredibly aggressive and violent. He was soon transferred to Colney Hatch Asylum. He was deemed a menace there, spitting food at people, attacking other patients and medical staff, and even attempting suicide. He had to be held down and put into a straitjacket. His aggression didn't seem to stop until October 1889, when he was confined to his bed. He soon grew weak and died of what was described as exhaustion of mania and pathesis pulmonalis on October 20th. Cohen was listed as a 23-year-old Whitechapel resident and a tailor. Nathan was the same age, and a tailor is closely associated with bootmaking. Now, how does someone go from Nathan Kaminsky to David Cohen? Well, Cohen never gave anyone his name. He merely yelled at people in Yiddish. At Colney Hatch, David Cohen was something of a John Doe title. Unnamed Jewish patients were just called that. It's entirely possible that Nathan Kaminsky, after being diagnosed with syphilis, grew to hate all women, especially prostitutes. Armed with a bootmaker knife, he went after someone he thought was a prostitute. He continued these attacks, growing more psychologically unhinged and using different knives, until he was a withered husk just wandering the streets. He may have also had an undiagnosed mental illness that went untreated. He left his home at Black Lion Yard and never came back. Cohen was listed as sometimes living in a Jewish homeless shelter at 84 Lemon Street. Nathan checks all the major boxes: hatred of women and violent, arrested in December weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's death. He died in October 1889. He lived in the absolute perfect spot, not too far from all the murder locations. He might have even been the mythical leather apron that the press spoke about in the early days of the case. Is this theory perfect? No. Colney Hatch's records are difficult to check, so verifying the John Doe explanation isn't easy. Robert Anderson, claiming a witness identified Kaminsky, is something I cannot answer. Perhaps there was a witness in a police file long since lost. His accusation also comes tinged with anti-Semitic beliefs that Jews won't turn on other Jews. Also, it's entirely possible Nathan Kaminsky may have just died a quiet death in 1888, which frequently happened in Whitechapel. Maybe David Cohen was just a disturbed individual who needed help and was not Nathan. It's not a foolproof theory, but it's a hell of a lot better than most. It's the favorite theory of the legendary FBI profiler John E. Douglas. In his book, The Cases That Haunt Us, he said, quote,
Jack the Ripper was either the man known to the police as David Cohen or someone very much like him.
It's also not remotely glamorous. Nathan Kaminsky wasn't some glorious figure. He was a nobody. An immigrant with a chip on his shoulder when it came to women, who worked a low-paying job and struggled to make ends meet. He got a terrible disease that would sooner or later kill him. This isn't the stuff of legends. This isn't Hannibal Lecter. But serial killers are rarely notable people with extraordinary talent. They are often nobodies. Has-beens, failures, people who get back at society through violence. Life can, however, be ironic sometimes. There was one last piece of evidence that can possibly tie Nathan to the murders, and it's his cause of death. While exhaustion of mania is a vague, outdated term that can mean a lot of things, pathesis pulmonalis is another word for tuberculosis. The date of infection is quite important. This disease can kill quickly if untreated, but death within a couple of months is not common. While it's possible Nathan merely picked up this illness through interactions with other patients, do recall that Annie was dying of a tuberculosis. She was also partially strangled, which meant the killer put his hands close to her mouth. Nathan died 13 months after Annie's murder. As many as 1/3 of all untreated tuberculosis victims die within 2 years or less. If all this information is correct, then the world's most famous serial killer was both nothing special and was indirectly killed by Annie Chapman. Not to mention, this is the same disease that took Polly's mother and brother, Elizabeth's mother, and both of Kate's parents. Truly a fitting fate for such a worthless man.
What time is it? I haven't felt the sunlight on me in a long time. Where am I again? I try to move my arms, but I just can't. These men try to make me eat, but I'm not hungry. Why can't they understand? They call me strange names. I don't think they know my name. What is my name? I can't even remember anymore. Why am I here? Did I do something wrong? Was it about those women? I want to go home to my family. I can't even remember what my home or family is. I feel weak and want to go to sleep. But none of these people want me to sleep. I just can't help it. I tell them over and over, yet they don't understand. I think I used to get mad at these people and fight them. I'm too tired for that. I'll just rest now. It's okay. I hope someone remembers me. Being alone forever is a sad thing.
Why does this man have so much fame? Was he the world's first serial killer? Hardly. They have been around since at least the Chinese Han Dynasty, probably longer. Was he the first major one in England? No. Elizabeth Ridgway was a serial poisoner executed in 1684. Was Jack the first major monster of the Victorian era? Nope, Mary Ann Cotton murdered as many as 21 people, including many of her children, before being hanged in 1873. Was Jack the worst killer in London at the time? Not even. Amelia Dyer was a London-based baby farmer who drowned potentially hundreds of children until 1896 when she was caught and executed. She was even claimed to be the Ripper at one point. Was Jack one of the cruelest killers in history? He was definitely cruel, but thankfully his victims died quickly, and the mutilations were after death. People like Lawrence Bittaker, an American-based serial killer, and previous Debunk monster Elizabeth Bathory, tortured their victims long before killing them. The truth is, there was nothing remotely special about Jack the Ripper. He was only famous because he struck at the right place and right time. If he had been a decade prior in another city, nobody would know him. But he attacked innocent women in 1888 in the capital of the world's largest empire, at a time when newspapers were flying off the printer. He's the world's most famous serial killer, and we wish he wasn't. We've played along enough, it's time for some harsh truths. How many man-hours have been wasted trying to catch him in the years since he died? How much money was made under his name? How much media has been created with his image? The world will never know, and he deserves none of it. He was a nobody. He never mattered. But we made him matter. We made him a legend. We made him immortal. 100 years from now, he'll still be with us. Books will continue to claim new suspects and evidence. The tours will continue to flourish, and movies will continue to be produced. We have moved mountains to try and find the impossible. All the while, we ignore what can't be known. So much can be said about the victims, the lives they lived because of the world they inhabited. These women were all someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's sister. They all had people who loved and cared about them. Polly left behind 5 children and a loving father. Annie's 2 surviving children grew up in a world without her. Her sisters and mother, Ruth, were just as heartbroken. Elizabeth only had the affection of Sven Olsen, the priest. He had known her for 17 years. He was a better father figure than her birth father, Gustav, had ever been. He most likely never forgot Elizabeth, up to the day he died in 1932 at age 91. Kate's 3 living children were present for her funeral alongside her entire family. Even if they didn't have an easy relationship with Kate, they still missed her. Mary Jane only had Joseph Barnett, who probably still remembered the prim and proper lady even after getting married. No matter the flaws they had, they were undeniably human. We've all known good people who struggle with money or alcoholism or disease. We can relate to people like Polly or Kate, but we can't relate to Jack. We can understand how a woman like Elizabeth and Mary Jane got through life. We can't truly understand a man who killed women because he hated them. Maybe it was Nathan Kaminsky. Maybe it wasn't. It really doesn't matter. The truth is, we can't find Jack. We can try. We can all try. Hell, we just spent the last part of this video doing that. We are just as guilty as anyone else. We can try pretty hard and find a good guess, but we can never make him real. We can, however, make the victims whole again. Jack took their lives, their image, their femininity. He left them as just photos and sketches, missing what made them women, what made them human. He wanted you to see them like that, but you don't have to play his game. You can see them as complicated people again. It's never too late. That's something Jack the Ripper fans just won't do. It's a game to them, or a challenge. They spend so much time pondering who Jack was, not what caused him or why his victims ended up in such a dire situation. They treat these murders like they happened thousands of years ago. Kane Tanaka is the oldest living person alive as of this writing. She was born in 1903. Her parents were alive in 1888. This isn't ancient history, it's still within living memory. Some of the victims, like Polly and Kate, even have descendants who still draw breath. Do you think they love seeing the graphic photos of their ancestors? Do you think they love hearing people say they were just prostitutes? There's a reason academia and well-respected writers have steered clear of Ripperology. It's a pseudo-history only a few steps removed from stuff like ancient aliens and Bigfoot hunters. At the end of From Hell, Alan Moore famously said, "Truth is, this has never been about the murderers, nor the killer, nor his victims. It's about us, about our minds and how they dance." Philip Sugden described Ripperologists and their beliefs as badly researched, ill-considered, and, in the worst cases, flagrantly dishonest. Haley Rubenhold has a lot of things to say about Ripperology, none of it kind. She sees them as men who want to play games guessing who a killer is, and only see the victims like pieces of a puzzle. They can claim they care, but they don't really. There is no sign of love behind the tears. To Ripperologists, they aren't women. They are just tools in a game of guess who. Rubenhold isn't wrong in her accusations. You built monuments and shrines to a monster. The least you can do is give respect to those who died. Even if the mystery of Jack the Ripper was one day solved, do you really think he would be what you want him to be? I suspect you wouldn't. Life isn't an episode of Criminal Minds. Life so rarely gives you what you want. Before we go, on this night, say a silent prayer for the 5. The video is dedicated to them. By telling their stories, we give them the justice they never got in life. The sands of time never stop flowing, even when all the time you had in your glass runs out. The silent surface of what is gone, but your story doesn't have to end at death. You can't put more time back in the glass, but you can flip the glass. It doesn't change the outcome, but it lets you see all the memories and moments that happened long before the end came. There will always be people who can remember your story, your hardships and triumphs, the good and the bad, the happy and the sad. They will always be with us. You will always be with us, if we remember. The day is done, the time has come. You tried your best, now it's time to rest. Mary Ann Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Kate Eddows, Mary Jean Kelly, remember their lives, not their end. Fare thee well.